Hello, here we are again for video 6. We are starting on page 92 where we left off. Our chapter we're starting on, in case you're following along in your own book, is Green Light. And we have just met James and Sam. And James is from Winnipeg, in Canada. And he has told us that he joined the fight because of what they called If Day in Winnipeg. And they were wanting people to buy war bonds. So for If Day, they pretended that the Nazis had conquered Canada and had taken over Winnipeg, and they arrested the prominent citizens, and they had to pay um, money to get out of jail and donate for the cause for the war. And so, because of that, Aunt James learned that we're stronger together. And so he has decided that he wanted to join the war effort. And he is going to jump out of an airplane. And so we're at green light. James struggled to his feet. In addition to the standard equipment he carried, his Bren light machine gun, extra bullet clips, Webley revolver, flares, knife, toggle rope, medical kit, canteen, and food rations. James was also carrying a weapon called a Piat. P-I-A-T. Piat stood for Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. The Piat could fire a bomb that would take out a tank if you got close enough. Very close. James carried the Piat and 6 of the 2.5-pound bombs in a separate canvas bag that would dangle from his leg during his descent. Worried he'd come down without something he needed, James had packed far more gear than he had ever practiced jumping with. Altogether, he had to be carrying around 100 pounds of weight. Sam was carrying even more, and James had to help him stand up. James clipped his static line to the overhead cable that ran the length of the plane. After they jumped, the lines they clipped to the cable would pull tight, yanking their parachutes open for them. James sucked in a big breath, swaying and bumping into the soldiers on either side of him. He thought being chased by Marvin Lennox and his gang was scary. That was nothing compared to what he was feeling now. He and the others had practiced jumping over and over again in England, but they had never jumped into a hail of bullets over enemy territory before. Patunk! A bullet tore through the bottom of the plane. It hit a soldier who was standing near James in the butt. He screamed and fell, but a medic was there a moment later to bandage him up and get him back on his feet. Either you were dead or you jumped. James's captain stood at the front to address the platoon. Alpha Company's mission, he began in a loud voice, is to protect the 9th Battalion's left flank during their attack on the Maryville Battery, then cover their advance to La Plaine. James and all of the rest of them had seen the reconnaissance maps. The Maryville Battery was a heavily defended, steel-reinforced concrete bunker on the Normandy coast, which housed 4 100mm howitzer cannons that were aimed right at the spot where soldiers would land on the beaches. La Plaine was a small village nearby. We will then seize and hold the Les Mesnil crossroads, the captain continued. Sure we will, James thought. He had a bad feeling about all this. Once you're down, head toward the objective as fast as you can, the captain told them. It will be dark, so fight the enemy at close quarters with knives and pistols and save the rifles for daylight. When you can see who you're shooting at, take no prisoners. They will just slow you down. Through the open hatch in the floor of the plane, James saw that the fog was gone. It had been replaced by white and red flak and tracer fire that crisscrossed in the black night sky. They would be lucky if any of them hit the ground alive. What the heck am I doing here? James wondered yet again. He looked at Sam. You volunteered for this, Sam reminded him. Click! The red light changed to green, but the airplane hadn't slowed down. James frowned. The airplane always slows down before they jumped in practice. Joe, go, go, go! The captain yelled. James shuffled along in line with the others, cradling his leg pack and the bag with his Bren machine gun in it. There were 3 men in front of him, then 2, then 1, then it was his turn, and James got down on the floor, dangled his legs over the side, and dropped out into nothing. Wow. Knees in the breeze. James dropped. He let go of the bags he held. Both were tied to him, and he pulled his legs up, knees together. Knees in the breeze, as their jump instructors called it. He fell for what seemed like an eternity. Shouldn't his chute have opened already? He panicked, worrying suddenly that he'd forgot to attach his static line inside the plane. Where was the manual release? Was he going to have to pull it? Then suddenly the cable connecting him to the plane went taut, and whoop! James' chute opened, jolting him hard. The rope tying the heavy bag with Pyatt and the anti-tank rounds to his leg tightened and yanked him in the other direction, and James screamed in pain. The parachute pulled one way, and the bag pulled the other, each of them trying to pull James apart. He stretched his arms down, trying to reach the rope on his ankle. White hot stars exploded in his eyes. If he could just pull up the bag, untie it, cut it, something, but he couldn't reach it. The rough strands of the rope cut into his skin. James's eyes rolled back in his head, and he felt himself losing consciousness. No, no, it was going to pull his foot off. It was going to cut right through his ankle and snap. The rope broke before his ankle did, and the heavy bag tumbled away into the darkness. Gone were the Pyatt and the anti-tank rounds, but James didn't care. All that mattered was the sweet relief of freedom. His ankle still throbbed where the rope had cut into him, but he was conscious and in one piece. James's arms and legs shook, and his breath came hard and fast, but his parachute seemed to be working. Tracer fire streaked all around him, blotted out here and there by black silhouettes of dozens of more parachuters. Suddenly, whoom! One of the dark shapes dangling from a parachute exploded, and James gasped. He struggled in his harness, trying to back away, but there was nowhere to go. What could the Germans be firing at them that would make a man explode like that? As the shock wore off, he realized there was no mystery. A German machine gun had hit something explosive the man was carrying. A gammon bomb, maybe. James watched in horror as the flames burned through the parachute's cord and the body plunged to the earth. Oh, God, James thought suddenly, was that Sam? But no, Sam hadn't been carrying a gammon bomb or anything else that would explode like that if it were hit. James let out a heavy breath. But where was his friend? Was he all right? Red-hot bullets screamed through the air around James, and he cursed and spun, trying uselessly to dodge them. The tracer fire came in high, missing him entirely, but he felt it rip at his parachute, filling it with holes and snapping some of the cords. The holes made him fall faster, and he twisted and turned, trying to see where he was coming down. He watched as another paratrooper hit the ground with a splash and disappeared. A splash? Was he coming down over a lake? There weren't any lakes on the map. James pulled up his chute, steering away from the water as best he could. He fell faster and faster. James's heart was in his throat. Where was he going to land? Everything was black. Was he coming down in a tree? A lake? A land full of mines? Right on top of a German garrison? The dark earth loomed up at James, and he closed his eyes and braced for impact. Excuse me. Rommel's asparagus. James came down hard and fast, tumbling wildly. He bumped and rolled and cursed before thumping into a stop at the base of a tree, completely bundled up from head to toe in his parachute. He was dizzy and sore. James' leg burned and his left arm throbbed. His heart pounded a drum beat in his chest. He shook his head to try and clear the cobwebs and remembered what he had to do next. Get free of the parachute. Make sure no one saw you coming down. James wiggled and turned, trying to get at the buckles and latches that strapped him into his parachute harness, but he was hopelessly tangled. He was going to have to cut his way out. He twisted awkwardly and pulled out his knife. He had just started to saw his way through the strings when he heard a rustling sound nearby. He froze. Was it German soldiers? Were they combing the field for him already? It didn't do any good to sit here listening when he was all wrapped up like a present for them. At the risk of it being heard, James hacked away at the parachute cords. The rustling sound got closer and closer. Footsteps. James could make them out clearly now, The strings were cut, but he was still tangled in the chute and couldn't see anything. He stabbed at the silk fabric and tore a long gash through multiple layers at once. Dark sky, tracer fire, spotlights. He was through. James blinked and gasped for air. No German soldiers stood over him, but the footsteps were getting closer. It sounded like there were two of them, a patrol. James ripped a bigger opening for himself and struggled through. He needed his machine gun or his pistol, but one was still in its bag and the other was taped to him so he wouldn't drop it in the air. The pistol was closer to his hand and he chopped away at the tape that bound it. The footsteps came up right behind the tree he was leaning against. The pistol was free. James twisted around the tree trunk and fell to his elbows and aimed, right into the eyes of a cow chewing its cud. James put his head down in the grass. Stupid as it was, that cow had almost for real killed him. It had just about given him a heart attack. The cow lowed softly and moved away, its 4 feet, the two pair of footsteps James had heard, rustling in the grass. The cow wasn't a pair of German soldiers, and the tree James had leaned against wasn't a tree either. He saw that now. It was Rommel's asparagus. Rommel's asparagus were big poles with sharpened tops that the German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had ordered planted in the ground, meant to gore Allied paratroopers and smash the Allied gliders that tried to land in the fields of Normandy. In aerial photos, they looked like asparagus growing out of the ground, was how they had gotten their name. James shuddered, thinking about how he had just missed landing on this one. James took a deep breath and tried to calm down. His body ached, but he had to get going, move toward his target. But where was he? James, that you? James jumped and nearly had another heart attack, but he recognized the voice at once. It was Sam. His friend emerged from the shadows, a dark silhouette against the glow from the anti-aircraft guns. James and Sam hugged each other. James had never been so glad to see anyone in his whole life. "Did you come down okay?" James asked. "Turned my ankle," said Sam, "but I'll be okay. Lost all my heavy gear, though." "Yeah, me too," James whispered. "Any idea where they are? I thought I saw another jumper hit a lake." "It's not lakes. The Germans flooded the fields." James cursed. "What am I doing here?" He held up a finger at Sam. "Don't say it." Sam shrugged. James collected his things. "Come on," he whispered. "Let's see if we can find somebody else here and figure out where we are." They didn't see any more parachutes or jumpers. At the edge of the field, though, they found a sleepy 2-story farmhouse. The lights were off and no one moved inside. It was after midnight, after all. "I don't remember this place from the aerial photographs they showed us," Sam whispered. "Yeah," James said. "We're supposed to be protecting the Ninth Battalion's flank, but where are they? And how are we supposed to know where we are? I suppose we could just go knock on their door and ask." James looked at Sam. "Are you serious? What if they're Germans in there?" Sam shrugged. "Then we shoot 'em." He held up his machine gun. "That is kind of what we came for. You got any better ideas?" James didn't. So they walked over to the farmhouse and knocked on the front door. "That way." James shared a nervous look with Sam as they waited at the front door of the farmhouse. A light came on upstairs and James gripped the trigger of his Bren gun. A window upstairs slid up and a round-faced boy with brown hair and pale skin stuck his head out. Hello, we're..." James began, but the boy closed the window as quickly as he had opened it and disappeared. James turned to Sam. "Do you think he's coming down?" James shrugged. "Maybe we should knock again." They waited for what seemed like an eternity. James was just about to knock again when the door opened and the boy was there, joined by a blinking old woman James took to be the boy's grandmother. The boy had a wild smile and dark eyes, and he hopped from foot to foot excitedly. His grandmother was much more sedate. She had wrinkled white skin and gray hair. They both wore threadbare nightgowns, and they were coming apart at the seams. Hello," James said. "We're Canadians. We're here for the invasion." The boy turned to his grandmother and spoke, delivering a stream of excited French that James didn't understand. He sagged. Of course these people speak French, he thought. We're in France. How were James and Sam ever going to ask them anything? James desperately tried to remember some of his high school French. Bonjour, je m'appelle, James began. Sam put a hand up to cut him off and spoke to the boy and the old woman in perfect French. The old woman's face lit up, and the boy answered back animatedly. James blinked. You speak French? He asked Sam. Of course I speak French, Sam said. I'm from Quebec. The old woman said something in French and tried to pull Sam inside. What are they saying? James asked. She wants us to come in and have tea, Sam said. The boy's excited for the invasion and is asking lots of questions about our gear. Sam politely turned down the woman's invitation and gave the boy his flashlight. The boy and the old woman spoke back and forth with Sam, who translated for James. Henry says they've been expecting the invasion for some time now. Henry? James asked. That's his name. That's Henry Chateau. Sam said, and his grandmother is Madame de Compagne. Henry's grandfather is at work. He's some kind of train station manager. Henry's mother is in the French Resistance, which is why he lives with his grandparents. So I'm going to cut in because I can't help it. So this is the man who was at the train station with Samira, who helped them derail the train. This was his wife and grandson. Okay, we don't need their whole life story, said James. Sam said something in French that was clearly about James, and the old woman laughed. What are you telling them? What are you saying? Never mind. Ask them where the Germans are. Où Allemand? James tried. The boy frowned, and Sam cleaned up the question in French for him. Ah, said Henry, brightening. He pointed to the east. The Germans are that way? James asked, excited to finally learn something. Henry nodded and pointed south. And that way? James asked. Henry nodded and said something else and pointed west. And that way? Sam translated. Henry nodded and said the same thing again and pointed north. And that way, Sam said again sadly. The boy and his grandmother smiled and nodded. James and Sam glanced at each other. They were surrounded by Germans. The Maryville Battery, James said. Ask them where that is. That question caused much back and forth between Henry and his grandmother. It sounds like it's a long way off from here, Sam said. About 11 kilometers to the north? 11 kilometers, James said. He did the quick math in his head. They dropped us 7 miles from where we're supposed to be. It'll take us hours to get there if we don't run into any Germans. Sorry, I'm seeing the time and seeing. I think we have enough time for one more chapter. This is called A Change of Plans. James and Sam weren't jogging, but they weren't walking either. They found a pace somewhere in between. They had a lot of ground to cover, and they were already late to the party. But they were both wary about running into German soldiers on the way. They had to stay their guard. Henry told me his father was taken away by the Nazis, Sam whispered, to work as a slave laborer in Germany. His mother ran away before they could do the same to her. You got all of that in the 5 minutes you talked to them? James whispered back. The de Compagne Shadows are very nice people, caught in a very difficult situation, James said. Yeah, I know the feeling, said James. They trotted in silence for a few more yards before James said, I know why I'm here, Sam. You volunteered. Yeah, but you did too. Why? Why are you here? I told you on the plane. I thought you were joking. James, I'm Cree, Sam said. I can't even vote in Canada. Not if I wanted to keep my tribal status. In the Army, I get to still be Cree and have respect. The question you need to answer is, why are you really here? James sighed. Because I'm an idiot. A human whistle cut through their conversation, and both soldiers instinctively dropped face first to the ground. Their bring guns thrust out in front of them. James held his breath and opened his senses, trying to see and hear as far as he could in the night. Sam was just as silent beside him. James' heart thundered in his chest. somewhere in the darkness whispered a Canadian code word, and James relaxed. Sam gave the coded reply, and the three shadows rose from a hiding place a few yards away. They were all privates from the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. Two of them were white, and one of them was black. That was something new. The Canadian Army had been segregated in the last war, but it wasn't now. James had seen a number of black soldiers at basic training in England. The two groups briefly introduced themselves. One of the new guys from British Columbia, and the other two were from back east, Ottawa and Hamilton. The black soldier's uniform was drenched, like he had landed in one of the flooded fields, and one of the white soldiers had his right arm wrapped up with a bandage. The other white soldier had a lot of little cuts all over his face and hands, like his parachute had dragged him kicking and screaming through one of the hedgerows that lined the fields and roads of Normandy. Two of them were privates from B Company, and one was a private from C Company. James and Sam were from A Company. Only the C Company soldier was in the right drop zone, and all of them were well away from where they needed to be. All their missions were to the north, so they had decided to stay together until they could rejoin their companies. They had just set off when James heard a sound unlike anything he's ever heard in his real life before. It sounded like a falling piano made in a cartoon, and it was getting closer and closer, and boom! A bomb exploded just a few dozen yards away, knocking them all down and showering them with rocks and dirt. Poom, 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 poom. The bombs fell like rain and kept falling. The soldiers scrambled for cover, but there wasn't much of anywhere to hide. James and Sam dragged themselves to the base of one of the hedgerows. Bombs pounded the field all around them. James felt the vibration of each blast in the pit of his stomach and the bottom of his teeth. "The Krauts found us!" James screamed. Sam shook his head and pointed at the sky, where the familiar shadows of British Lancaster bombers flew overhead. James watched in horror as they dropped their entire payload of bombs right on top of them. He couldn't believe it. Their own allies were dropping bombs on them. They were supposed to be hitting German strongholds. The ground troops weren't attacking. This was a registered paratrooper drop zone. "They must have gotten off course with all the clouds," Sam said. "Or they chickened out and they're dropping their bombs early so they can get out of here," James yelled. Poom, poom, poom. The bombing went on for more minutes than James could count, and then as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The heavy pounding stopped, and the explosions still rang in their ears. "Our own planes!" the white soldier from British Columbia yelled. "Our own planes were trying to kill us. First they dropped in the wrong place, then they bombed us," James howled. The white soldier from C Company still lay on the ground, and at first they worried he was dead. But he wasn't injured at all. He was just crying, and he wouldn't get up for a long time afterward. They were all rattled by the bombing. The black soldier walked aimlessly around the cratered clearing, just to do something with his shaking body. "What are we doing here, Sam?" James asked again. "Seriously, what?" Sam was so unnerved by the bombing he didn't even give James a funny answer. He must have been asking himself the same thing. "I hope Henry and his grandmother weren't hit," Sam said quietly. James hoped so too. "Come on," said James. "Let's just get this nightmare over with." They gathered their wits about them and set off to the north again. James glanced at the sky, wondering if and when their own allies would bomb them again, and he caught the others doing it too. About 30 minutes had passed when they ran into another 15 Canadian paratroopers, led by Major McLeod from C Company. McLeod was a tall, thin Nova Scotian with a brown mustache that looked like a horsehair brush. He wasn't from James's company, but he was now the ranking officer in the group. "I was supposed to have a heavily armed force of more than 100 men with machine gunners, heavy mortars, Bangalore torpedoes, the lot," McLeod declared. He certainly didn't have that now. James counted 20 men with nothing more than 3 machine guns, 8 Bren guns, a few pistols, and 1 Piot. We'll have to do," McLeod said. "We have a mission. Destroy the enemy radio station at Verville, capture or destroy the enemy headquarters there, and blow the bridge over the Devet River." He paused and looked around. And that's just what we're going to do. James shot a disbelieving look at Sam. Do all that with just 20 men? The major was nutters. But, sir, we're not with Charlie Company, Sam said. You boys from other companies are too far away from your objectives to make it in time, McLeod told them. We're near Veville. With your help, we have just enough men to give it a go. Listen, he told the whole group. We don't fulfill our objectives, and all those boys coming off the boats in a few hours are going to have more fight than they can handle. We're here to do a job, and by God, we're going to do it. And just like that, James and Sam were off to attack the Nazis at Varaville. We're at 25 minutes, so we're going to go ahead and stop for video 6. In video 7, we'll begin with the chapter Goldilocks and the Two Canadians. I hope that you're enjoying this. It's very intense. It has a lot of intense moments, and thinking back, it has a lot of intense emotions that the different characters go through. So just go ahead and make notes of anything you want to talk about when we do our virtual meeting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the characters and what you think and how you think it would feel to jump out of an airplane, because that's a hard no for me. I hope you're enjoying this, and I'll see you in video 7. Thanks, guys.